Hey folks, welcome to The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, the podcast for promoting critical thinking, progressive politics, and left-wing philosophy. I'm excited to present this episode because I'm a big fan of my guest. This time around I talked to Taylor McNallie, who's an organizer with Inclusive Canada, and it was a really good conversation about her organization and some of the work she's been doing. Then, in the second half of the show on Red Reviews, Justin takes us through Engels, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, and if you stick with me that long after Red Reviews, I will read The Anarchist Turn by Jacob Blumenfield, Chiara Bottici, and Simon Crickley. I'm probably pronouncing all those names wrong. It's a book that came out in 2013 and is about how the negative view of anarchy has started to shift and it's becoming more feasible as a goal. So I'm going to read that for about 15 minutes right at the end of the show. That's going to be a reoccurring segment for a while. So with that, not much else to say. I don't have a major rant or rave to discuss this time around. So with that, I'm just going to send you into the interview with Taylor McNallie. Hi, and welcome to The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, the podcast where I talk to a variety of people to promote progressivism, left-wing politics, and critical thinking. Today I'm joined by Taylor McNallie, activist out of Alberta, our neighbors.
I thought this were for right wing, so I'm going to have to leave. This is not for No.
Yeah, no, definitely a left-wing show.
No, I'm here for it. It's great.
I was just interviewed on another podcast, and he's kind of a centrist, the guy who interviewed me. And I said, when I talk about right-wingers on my show, I'm not fair. Like, I'm just not. Mm-hmm. And that's okay.
Yeah, good. This should not be fair. Yeah.
So I guess a good place to start is a little bit about your background, what got you started in activism, and yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like for many racialized people that it kind of just becomes the life at some point, because this is things we are battling our entire lives, and eventually you just have enough and you get activated and involved. And I think right now was a really great time for that to happen during the largest civil rights movement in history, because you didn't feel alone in your actions and initiatives. There were so many people globally getting involved. So it was easy to kind of find your people, find where you were needed and what you could do. So I got involved in activism. I still don't really enjoy the word activist. But I got involved last year, obviously after the murder of George Floyd, and protests just sparked up globally. And I'm from rural Alberta, and that's where I first experienced a lot of racism. So I felt, why not bring those conversations to rural Alberta, which sparked an interesting chain of events. And my organization was first RAW, Rural Alberta Against Racism, because we focused on rural Alberta. We've since rebranded, renamed, and focus on many issues across the country. That's
cool. Yeah. I think Saskatchewan and Alberta in the rural sense have a lot of similarities. Like I sometimes deliver mail, and one of the towns I go through, there's a person who has a Confederate flag in their window in their house. And I drive by it when I'm working that route. I drive by it every day. I'm like, one of these days I got to throw a rock at that. Like,
yes. Bring them all down. All of them.
Like, it's just ridiculous. Like,
I'm actually, I was born in Saskatoon. I moved out here when I was 10. So I've been out here since.
Okay.
My first 10 years of life, obviously, I was very young, so I didn't notice a lot. So I felt like Saskatoon was a beautiful place. And then, of course, as an adult now, I'm like, everywhere's awful. So
yeah, that's right. Yeah, nothing is good anywhere.
Yeah, nowhere is safe.
So I guess, obviously, the show, we talk about political philosophy a lot. So what is your political ideology?
Like I was saying before we started, I feel I don't know. Labels have never been a good place for me to begin with. I don't know where I lie. I just lie whatever feels good and feels good for people and humanity and the world in general. Many people, of course, would say that's very left leaning, that I'm radical and an extremist. That's fine. If that's what people want to label me as because I want the best for people, then I guess that's what I am. But yeah, I've never, it's the same with religion too. I'm not a religious person. I'm spiritual. But I don't block anything out. I'm 30 years old now. So anything I hear along the way, I'm like, hey, that sounds pretty good. I'm going to explore that. And then I'll put that in my pocket and I'm a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So
that's fair.
I'm just all over the place.
No, that's fair. Yeah. One of the things, like when it comes to religion, we used to like just label that truth seeker, right? Like you're just a person who's out there looking around. With political ideology, I'm not sure what we could call it.
I almost feel it could be the same though, looking around. There's so many, there's so many different labels of ideologies popping up all of the time, right? Like even the same with religion, there was only, one main thing, or at least in the Western world of what we thought was normal. And then now, especially as more and more people, I don't want to use the word wake up because we all know how that's being used now, but just realize how we are being played in this capitalist system that, I feel we just change over time anyway and find new ideologies or things to believe in. So. Yeah.
Like, I've identified as an anarchist for quite a long time. And then, I've over the few years as I read various things, I add different labels. And like right now I call myself an anarcho-communist, but also I've got, like people who are into communalism or municipalism. And like, there's these different ideologies that are very close, like with just a tiny little change one way or another.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, there's a lot of words that, even Antifa, I'm gonna be real with you. I didn't know what that word was until people in Alberta started calling me the queen of it last year. And I was like, what the fuck is Antifa? So I'm like Googling, I'm like, well, yeah, I'm Antifa. Should you not be Antifa? What is wrong here? So there's a lot of things that I'm exploring and learning about. And, I've never learned so much about communism in my life either. So it's very interesting.
I think we seem to be in like a great moment where, like you say, like with the global movements against racism and even the awakening, like you say, like against capitalism, we're in a real moment where people are like seeing at least that we don't have to just automatically support the status quo.
Absolutely. So. Exactly. Because the status quo is not good for any of us. And, COVID, I feel, although COVID is awful, although we have lost a lot of people to it, I feel it allowed us to really see just how, I don't want to say broken the systems are because they've been designed this way, but to see what they are like and how, nothing has ever been set up for the people to take care of the people. And it's like, damn, we've been screwed this whole time.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess, you said you were labeled the queen of Antifa. Where did that come from?
Oh, Lord. From many of the hate groups and these right-wing idiots out here. I don't want to even drop names because they are not fucking worth it. But the moment I started going out to rural communities to have these discussions, that's when we opened up a whole can of worms and people were not okay with us going into their towns. I'm like, yo, I'm from here. Literally.
This is my town.
I like this town of 400 people. Yeah, no, I live here. I lived here. So, it's been very interesting. And, it's just other tactics that have been used throughout history to squash movements such as these, where the rise of the people, God forbid those most oppressed become liberated so that we can all be liberated. Oh my goodness, we're all equals? No.
You can't have that.
Can't have that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's, it doesn't feed I know there's discussions amongst various people with reducing everything to class, but those who are powerful they want us divided on long lines of like race and class and gender, and they want us divided so that they can just maintain their power, right?
Exactly. That's exactly it. And it's so funny right now with this freedom movement of people against against lockdowns, right? And how are you out here marching for freedom while also wanting your 80-hour work week back? I'm very confused. Do you know what you're marching for?
At the start of COVID, I actually thought that we were in like this moment where we would have a community, like we'd wake up to this, like, hey, we got to take care of each other. Like, yeah, powers that be, maybe we should lobby them as a group of like general strike or whatever to get support when we need it. Cause nobody can go out. We all have to stay home. But instead, everybody's just like, oh no, I want to go to the gym and I got to go to the hairdresser.
I need to get a haircut. Oh my God. Like, Linda, you haven't cut your hair in 5 years. You don't need to go to the haircut.
And suddenly you need a haircut.
Yeah. And I feel like it would have went that way if there wasn't that aspect of an actual civil rights movement. I feel that way. I feel like we would have banded together in that way and been like, fuck the government. Yes. But then we wouldn't have got to the underlying issue, which is that racial inequality, capitalism, but capitalism does stem from systemic racism. We wouldn't get to that. And so, we're doing it the hard way and we're doing it the right way, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, that is, like you say, the right way and hard way seems to be the way that it needs to be done.
Yeah.
Which I've been talking to a friend and we talk about like, are we going to end up in like a kind of a revolution and how are people going to get hurt in this? And I mean, lots of people are being hurt now. So where do we balance that is like, I guess it's a tough question. Yeah.
I every day I wake up and think about, I can go to all of the police meetings and sit with all the government officials and we can talk this out and we can all come together and find a way to do this. And then the other half of me, the realistic, I want to say half is like, nah, we got to burn it all down. We got to start over because unfortunately these conversations and meetings have been happening for a very long time. Like the fact that the Canadian government cannot even implement the TRC 94 calls to action or the 231 calls for justice. They can't even do that. And we think that we can just talk this out. It's not going to happen. Right. So I feel like, a civil war will and does need to happen in order for us to go to where we need to go next. And I'm here for it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, in a sense, like you have to be if you want any kind of change, right? You got to be. I don't want to pretend that it's not scary. Because a lot of people are going to get hurt. But again, like when you equate that against the number of people who are being hurt now, I just don't know if it's going to be that different. Yeah, it's very true. And then if we can get a better world out of it, good. Right? Because, I don't know. I feel like I don't know if we'll see the start of that war in our lifetime or, if there will be change happen. My daughter's 10. Is she going to get to see any of the change from the work we're putting in now? Will it be my grandkids? Will we even it's a hard thing to look at and see, but it has to be done. So, yeah, that's right. I'm not promoting war on this show. Just so everybody is aware. We're speaking hypothetically. Mm-hmm. Yes. There's a cop outside my house right now. You can just chill out. Yeah. The thing, one of the things about that, whether talking about it, like you say, you can go to the police meetings and the city council meetings and all this stuff. And the answer always seems to be for police, oh, well, they need more training. Oh, well, they need more training. And it doesn't do anything. It just makes things worse. Yeah, because they're still sitting on all of these biases. And, we know where
the police stemmed from. We know how they were created. Those ideologies are still rampant within those institutions. Like our police chief here cannot even bother to get rid of a thin blue line patch from their uniforms. How can we move forward past anything if you can't even do that one tiny thing? It's so small.
Honestly, they should have known, like society, I guess, should have known as soon as they were talking about things like the thin blue line, that something was really broken, right? Like of the idea that police have to protect each other from accountability. It's bizarre. It's
Yeah, but that's where, you know, and speaking of propaganda, and that's where those things pop up, where it's like they twist it, right? They see it as, no, this is our line of solidarity between each other because we're doing a dangerous job. And then those who have never seen police in the way racialized people have seen it, they're like, well, yeah, it's a really dangerous job. They should be using that. Like, so then it's like, then you have to battle that, because then you still have to prove your experiences as a Black, Indigenous, brown, anybody, a type of person where we have not a good relationship with police, but then, you know, we're gaslit like, well, that didn't happen because I've never seen it. Like, okay, Jim. All right.
You know, white dudes, like myself, are often like that, like with everything. If it's not right in front of our faces, then we don't see it. But part of the problem now is like there's so much evidence of police brutality. Like they're literally the bad guys in every situation. And it's hard. I don't know how anybody can deny it now. Well,
you know, again, they look for everything to villainize that person, right? Like if I were to be shot today, there are at least 5 things they'd be able to pull up from my past to be like, see, she should have died. Like, she was a bad person, you know, and you could dig up on anybody, you know, maybe you got suspended from school in grade 8 because you brought a joint to school. See, he's a criminal, you see, and he went through a bad life, you know, so they villainize somebody, and make it seem like they deserved it, when really that just emboldens, you know, racism. If you already don't like Black people, well, instead of just saying, yeah, I'm racist, fuck that Black dude, you're like, well, see, he's a criminal, you know. It's just
right. Yeah, I mean, I guess in a way that's how media has portrayed people of color for so like the whole time anyway, right?
Yeah.
That's why we needed to control, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very true.
Ridiculous.
Yeah.
So I guess, why don't you tell me a little bit about your organization, Inclusive Canada?
Yeah, so Inclusive Canada, there are 3 co-founders, and then we brought on another team member. So there's me, there's an Anishinaabe woman, she's in BC, she's a teacher, she's been on the front lines doing this work for 30 years. We got an Iraqi woman, and she is also a teacher, and she is like, we call her Miss K. We cannot give her name out because some of the work she does with our organization is incredibly dangerous and amazing. And I'm just so in love with this woman. And then we have another woman who also is the founder of the Community YYC. And so we work together in so many different areas. I feel like we are trying to do a million things all at once. The first and foremost, though, is providing education, you know, in a world of misinformation and propaganda. Again, it's so important to somehow bring that education to the people.
Right.
Even within this anti-lockdown movement, you know, we start bringing signs that just lists like, hey, Kevin J. Johnson has like all of these things, even though you can go on the first page of Google and find them. These people aren't reading shit. You just bring that and they're like, oh, wow, I didn't know about that. Like, we've had some people where it's like, okay, maybe I am standing on the wrong side. You know, holding events, making sure we get information out to the people on so many different issues. Right. Holding rallies, providing opportunities for youth and other racialized people. We have some big plans for this year, but we'll see how it goes on them. We are all exhausted right now.
Oh, I believe it. Yeah.
I need a goddamn break. But a lot of what we've been doing lately has definitely been to counter a lot of the misinformation within this anti-lockdown movement, because in Alberta it is rampant. We have one of them, we have Kevin J. Johnston running for mayor in the city right now. I don't even know how that happened.
Yeah, didn't he said something like he's threatened people or something, and then
all of Alberta Health Services has a restraining order against, all of Alberta Health Services. He could walk into Walmart and there's an Alberta Health Service employee and he has to leave. That is where it's at. And, nobody is officially running for mayor. Nobody's official until September, when they have to also get vetoed in. I don't think he's going to be make it past September to begin with. But the fact that this man is out here, people are buying his signs, people, and, Calgary would vote for this person. That's the mentality of this province. Yeah. It's sad. This province is sad.
Yeah, I don't know what to say. It's frustrating. Regina and like Saskatoon, Saskatchewan in general is like almost a smaller microcosm of Alberta in a lot of ways. Chris Sky, he came to Alberta first and then he came to Saskatchewan. And actually the only reason I knew he had ties to white supremacist movements is I think because I saw it on Inclusive Canada's Instagram page or something.
Oh, good. Yeah. Well, and that's it. Some of the slides we post are, it's simple information that's available out there. But if I've only just heard of Chris Sky a couple months ago when he started doing this tour. I'm like, who is this guy? And people are posting about him. It's like, unless you are looking actively for these people, if you're already in that movement, you are going to follow that. But unless you're actively looking for this information, how would you know? So even providing that, and people just I had no idea. Or, when they started having tiki torch marches and nobody knew, the tiki torch itself is not a racist symbol, but how it's being used with white nationalists and hate groups, it becomes a racist symbol. And kind of connecting those two people are like, I had no idea. Just providing information for the people.
Yeah, it's like Charlottesville. After Charlottesville, every guy that had that Richard Spencer haircut, if I saw him in the store, I was very suspicious.
Not gonna lie, usually for me, it's white bald men.
That's fair. That's
who
fair.
Are you? But nah.
I have stubble. I have a little bit of stubble.
But even that in itself is sad, and that comes from a place of fear. You can relate it to people being fearful of Black people or Indigenous people. It comes from a place of trauma, fear. I used to love bikes and bikers. I used to hang out with so many bikers. I hear a bike now and my whole body is just filled with anxiety because we have been harassed and followed by bikers for the last year, So, these are things that just get instilled into us, and still having to break through those fears and understand, not everybody. So
I have never been a bike person. I relate it to, I guess, tangential situations with the Hells Angels. I knew people who knew the Hells Angels and had to deal with them. And so I was always very suspicious of bikers.
Man, even them, though, Hells Angels, they used to be a totally different type of group. Those claiming to be Hells Angels now are just, it's not the same. Things are not the same.
Yeah, no, there's been a lot of changes the last while. You used to be able to say, okay, this is a criminal organization, but, criminal organizations fight the police and that makes them good in this way. And that, they don't necessarily deal with regular citizens. But now you've got such a commingling. Sometimes the criminal organizations are part of the police and the police are doing these things too.
I mean, yeah, that's been a thing forever. We can stem that back to the Klan in this country. And that's another thing that my partner with Inclusive Canada will be working on with some other anti-racism activists here is putting together events to directly link those people together, and how, Klan members were police officers or are police officers, or, we still have active members here in Alberta. There were many settlements of clan members here. And so making all those connections, you know, even we put together this petition to take Kevin off from running. And the person in the government, in the UCP, who we have to go to, is best friends with all of these people. Like, he had to be called out in the media on, like, are you friends with Artur Pawlowski? It's like, nah, I'm not. I don't know that person. It's like, really? Because we have all of these video over here of y'all being buddy-buddy. No? Okay. So it's just like, everything's just so intertwined. And,
yeah.
You know, yeah, we'll look like a crazy person trying to, like, map them all out. But it's like, it's so necessary.
Yeah, that's one of the things that, like, it on the left, or being an anti-racist, or being like a person who sees things systemically, you often sound like a conspiracy theorist. But
like, who needs conspiracy theories when, like, this is real life? Like,
yeah, that's right.
You know, let me show it to you. Yeah.
We don't have to make things up about drinking the adrenochrome from babies. We have real connections with real problems.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And I again, you know, I sympathize with some of the people getting mixed up in these anti-lockdown movements, anti-mask, whatever, because, you know, we are at our most vulnerable. And, you know, yeah, the government has been fucking us over this whole time. Welcome to the party. You know, I remember my first time when I first figured that out. And so it's so easy to get wrapped up in that and be like, yeah, we have to put a stop to this. This is not okay. But, you know, it just gets picked up by other people who has a totally different agenda.
Yeah,
yeah, right? Yeah. Just like, man, I don't know what to do.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad there's organizations like yours out there, because a person like myself, like, I can do a podcast, but honestly, without some kind of other guidance, I'm often not sure what to do or where to go even.
I think we all feel that way. It's okay. It's okay. I feel like that often. Like, I don't know. Where do we go from here? Like, I feel defeated at least 3 times a day. And I'm like, I'm done. I'm done with this. But it's like, we have to keep going.
Got to keep doing something, right?
Yeah.
Like I say, we have kids. Everybody's got kids. So we got to make the world as good as we can.
Yes, absolutely. Otherwise, our kids, like, people don't want to be messing with our kids. I know if my kids got to be doing what I'm doing, everybody better watch out. I would not want to mess with her when she's 30 and having to deal with all this.
Oh, geez, eh? Yeah. Growing up in activism, that's how you get, like, a lot of well-known activists now who are really vilified by the right. Like Tupac Shakur's mom. Like, she's considered a criminal by many people in the conservative movement, and I guess even by the U.S. state, but she's a hero to many, right?
Yeah. It's funny with things like even Martin Luther King, where the majority of white people hated that man. And then these same white people are out here, like, quoting him and putting up memes of him. I'm like, no. Y'all would have been the 80% of white folk who hated him and called him Antifa, probably, you know, like,
that's right.
That's just anything that is so radical that betters the world for all people. You are automatically vilified. So
I guess, you have a lot of, like, videos of various protests and stuff. So that must be coming from a lot of members of your organization, or is that a lot of your own work?
Like, just videos of in attendance, or?
Yeah. Or like, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I, especially last year, like, we traveled all over Alberta. Every weekend we were in a different location.
Oh, wow.
The longest we had to drive was like a 16-hour round trip. That was to go to Grimshaw, Alberta, where a man was wearing, like, a pillowcase, like a Klan's hood, at the post office at like 2 p.m. Everyone's like, no, it's fine. It's just a mask. This is not a mask. This is not okay. So, you know, to me, you know, even before activism work, you know, my work is very much community based. Like, I want to support everybody. I want to show up for everybody. And not just because I want people to show up for me. This is just what community does. You show up for people. So, you know, many of the things, pictures, videos I post are my own, or us being there, in support and to show that solidarity. But, you know, even though it's just Inclusive Canada, like we work with so many other grassroots organizations and movements. We have a huge group of people that we work with constantly every day. You know, if we have an action or an initiative, it goes into that chat and everybody is involved. It's not just one person, one group.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, we're almost at 30 minutes. So I guess a good place to start a counter propaganda.
All right.
Is there any piece of misinformation that you feel is dominating right now, or that you have seen a lot of, that you want to counter?
Yeah. I mean, let's talk about Antifa for a minute.
Sure.
Because, you know, and I bring this up because I was in the CPS commission meeting yesterday, and it's been an ongoing thing for a while, but especially recently and lately, where these what do they call it? They call it the redirect team, where they're trying to redirect youth and people out of extremist lifestyles. Okay. And they label Antifa alongside people like ISIS and the Proud Boys. Yes. And it's like, this is coming directly from the police. Like, no wonder we look like criminals. No wonder, like, and people still don't understand that Antifa is not an organization. You know, it is a network of groups and individuals who are out here promoting anti-racism, promoting anti-capitalism. And that is why it's so vilified, because it completely stops the governments, you know, from doing what they need to do to keep us going. And so they need, but it's just, it's always shocking. It never gets less shocking to hear them say that my existence of being anti-fascist is radical. But it was neat because, you know, I posted this video on my Twitter before hopping on here, and before he says it, he talks about, you know, the suffragettes movement. And he's like, you know, back then it was looked at as radical, but now we wouldn't even bat an eye at that. And I just cannot wait for the day when they look back at this and see how ridiculous they were to look at somebody, to look at the idea of anti-fascism, which is literally what Antifa means, and think that was their biggest threat. And, you know, they label extremism as, you know, people who will use violence to further their movement. And, you know, as we're talking of how to move forward in all of this, there might have to be violence. Like, look at our history. Unless people want to step up and not vilify, you know, this ideology of Antifa, and just allow, you know, actually do the work. If you're committed to anti-racism, let's actually do that. Why would you say no to defunding $10 million from a $450 million budget so you can fund, you know, community services that take care of the people? You know, actually do that work so we can be better. Otherwise, that's the direction they push us into. So, you know, it's frustrating because, you know, like I said, I didn't even know what the word Antifa was until I started getting called it. And people are like, she's the queen of Antifa. I'm like, what is this? Like, and I had to literally Google it. And I was like, is this really, are they saying this is a bad thing? Like, aren't you, like, everyone should be Antifa. That's just like,
back in, I think it was 2015, they used to call us SJWs for social justice warrior. And I was like, wait, that's supposed to be an insult?
Like, yeah, that's me. Yeah. Okay,
I guess.
Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know how to counter that. You know, people are very stuck in their ways. That's another reason why I think, you know, our only option is towards that complete civil unrest, because we are in this space where, like, people are just so lost and stuck. Like, trying to have a conversation with somebody who it's very divided, and people like to think, you know, us as Black people, Indigenous people, that we are creating this divide, a divide that has been here for hundreds of years. And it's just, even more so now, trying to have a conversation with somebody on the other side, you are literally talking to a wall. It's like how I don't know how to get through to people anymore. But I don't know how to combat that. But man, it's the most ridiculous thing.
I think I tend to think that it's because they have such a dominant like media presence, right? Like even I know Ezra Levant is considered kind of a fringe dude, but he's got a huge following, right?
Yeah, and he has so many people working for him.
So he just spouts nonsense, like, and so does whatever his one buddy,
Keen.
Yeah.
Keen.
Yes, that's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know if he's still with Rebel or if he's moved on. I'm not sure, but yeah, the thing with that is like there's so many independent journalists. Like we just held a rally for abolition, and there were two of them in the crowd that we hadn't noticed, right? And so they're like hiding in the bushes and hiding in the back and taking video. And then, a few days later, I go on Twitter and I'm like tagged and shit. I'm like, why? Who spends their Sunday doing this? You literally spent 3 hours following us around all day for this really shitty footage. Like, yeah. I don't. So yeah, it's hard, but that's all they have. And if they have a media source that is, pumping everything they believe in, oh, they're going to love it. They're going to eat it up.
Yeah, that's right. John Gormley here doesn't do quite the same thing as Ezra Levant, but it's very similar. Like the same, he's ruined the critical thinking capabilities of the Saskatchewan populace for the last 20 something years.
Ugh.
Calling left-wing people reactionaries and people who are like following health guidelines, he calls them reactionaries. Like he has no idea what these words mean.
No, it's so wild. Like, you know how often I have to wear a mask? Like maybe 2 hours a week, maybe when I go grocery shopping, or if I go into the store. Right. Like, I don't know the whole idea of, this started because people don't want to wear a mask and they feel oppressed. And I'm just like, I cannot. Like,
well, I mean, it's pretty obvious they don't know what oppression means.
No. And it's sad because the moment these health guidelines are gone, they're out here fighting for freedom for everybody. But the moment these are gone, do you think they're going to be out marching for anybody else ever again? So this is not about freedom. No.
And I never saw any of these people protesting for Black lives, right? Or for Indigenous lives. Like this is not something they don't actually care about people. They care about inconvenience.
Yes, exactly. And racism. They want to uphold that.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Accountability.ab.ca on Instagram.
Yes, everybody go to that page, report the shit out of it, get it off. I haven't looked back on it for a while, so I don't know what they're up to now. But it started out as like this page to share more things about the UCP, about these anti-lockdown people. It's a white-led page. Obviously somebody, it's hard because there's some anarchists out here who have been doing this work for a very long time. They have connections with people, with anti-racism activists, but they still end up centering themselves instead of still listening to racialized people and what our needs are. Right. But essentially, we had organized a counter protest in Edmonton, and a couple of the people there were not happy we were doing that, and it turned into this big blowout that we were not listening to the people, even though we worked with so many organizations on that. And then they went for months just trying to dox me and dox eight other of our members, just put us on blast, and it's like, while you're saying you are for Black lives, you have Black Lives Matter in your bio, and you're literally doxing Black activists out here who are already afraid for their lives, who are already too scared to leave their homes, and you are spending your time doxing activists. Like, do you know what that looks like on you? So,
yeah, that's messed up.
Yeah, it was not good. So that page just shut it down. And
sounds good.
And then, of course, you know, the regular suspects, Pat King and Kevin Johnston and Artur Pawlowski and whoever else out there that is just trash.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good list of foes.
Yeah.
All right. And how about comrades? We've got,
yeah.
You've got quite a list here.
Yeah. You have the list. You read them because I'll forget names.
Bear Clan.
Yay.
Lloydminster and Vermilion for Equity. The Community YYC. Water Warriors YEG. BLM YYC. And Defund 2 Fund.
Yeah.
Native Calgarian.
Yes. And I'm probably still missing so many. Anti-racism action. I know there's a few different pages, but I believe they go under anti-racism action here. They are another, you know, they're another group out here that have been doing this work for a very long time. And I respect them and looked up to them a lot. So, yeah.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
I guess we got a little bit of time left. So I wanted to ask you about your opinion on defunding police and abolition. Like, what do you think the goal, or not the goals necessarily, but the method to get to abolition is?
Number one is defund. So you have to take money from these police institutions and give them to grassroots organizations, grassroots movements who are already doing this work. So, for example, like Bear Clan Calgary, they are in Edmonton and Winnipeg and Lethbridge and a few other places, but they are Indigenous led, and they completely volunteer their time, dedicate their entire lives to being those people, first responders on the ground, basically. So they are out giving food to the people, the unhoused community, those most vulnerable. They help those with addiction issues. You know, they bring the Noxalone kits with them and have to deal with that. They are, you know, trained in de-escalation. And because they are not in uniform and they're not police, people are not scared of them on the street. You know, sex workers, they're the first people they call. If you see an unhoused community member, you know, passed out in the snow, you can call them. They are out there taking care of the people. They're not a registered organization. I don't know if that's because, you know, being a registered organization is part of colonialism hugely, especially when you are applying for it. But, you know, they rely on community donations, whether that's monetarily or with, you know, clothing, food, all of that. Why not give them some money to do their work that is obviously working? Because the CPS themselves have approached them to be like, you know, how is what you're doing working? And every time we go out, we hurt people, you know, like if you have to go to them to, you know, wondering how to do your job, just give them the money. They're out here doing the work anyway. Yeah. But so, you know, that's within community safety, and then harm reduction and queer community support and disability discrimination. Like there's so many areas. We are supposed to be taking care of each other and looking out for one another. And we need those resources to do so. And, you know, CPS, I think they ended up defunding $8 million themselves. Nobody knows where that money has gone. Most of us found out 2 weeks before the applications closed that it was even available. And then, of course, only if you were registered could you apply. So it's a lot of nonprofits that still have a lot of anti-Black racism, a lot of systemic racism running rampant in their institutions anyway. So, yeah. So, yes.
It's like you say, like the whole act of registering, like for an Indigenous organization, an Indigenous-led organization, the idea of registering under a colonial government seems pretty counterintuitive to me.
Right? Yeah. Let me just keep paying taxes to you as you kill my people and take my land and all of these things. No. So, you know, the first step is defunding and funding. You know, I like to say defund the police to refund our communities, because as great as it would be to just have the police gone tomorrow, you have to have those structures in place first that would replace them. And they have to be, it's not something that it happens overnight. This is going to take a long period of time because we have relied on police for everything for so long. Yeah. So, you know, disarm for sure. And, you know, slowly get into a place where grassroots structures and organizations are taking care of the people, and we get rid of police. They're not needed.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I just like posted a whole bunch of links for somebody on Reddit because they asked, what is the logic behind this defunding the police thing? And I was like, well, here's a bunch of resources.
Hopefully they read them. Like, shit.
Yeah, hopefully. But then their next comment said, oh, I'll try to get to those right away or as soon as I can. But what about this thing where people want to take away the body armor from police? Because that doesn't seem logical to me. And I'm like, well, if they don't have guns, if they don't have body armor, like, then they're not going to be as violent with the random homeless person that they need, you know, that they're dealing with. Because most of the situations they're dealing with aren't armed conflict with drug cartels. Right?
No, it is not. It is not. And even then, you know, I think people are so used to looking at the surface level issue, right? So you see a gang that is very violent and they need to be controlled. Okay, but why not? Where's the prevention and intervention on the way there? Yeah. And that is meaning dealing with, I don't want to use the word dealing with, but, you know, having structures in place to help children in unhealthy home situations, you know, and stop that intergenerational trauma from happening. Make sure people are not growing up and living in poverty. Make sure, you know, when people are happy and their needs are met and they don't have to do things that are illegal in order to get by in life, and then find them doing things that maybe they probably wouldn't. Like there's just so many steps that need to be taken to ensure the happiness or the well-being of somebody so that they can have a chance in life. Yeah. And even just mental health support in general to deal with trauma, to deal with the things they're going through. You know, there's a lot of things. Yeah. Having police deal with everything just turns everybody into a criminal, right? Like, yes.
Like you say, unhoused people become criminals. Drug addicted people become criminals. A person who happens to have too much to drink that night becomes a criminal because they fall asleep on a bench, right? Like the police aren't solving anything. They just turn everybody into a criminal. And you know, coming from, again, a rural community where everybody drinks and drives. Everybody drank. Everybody drove afterwards. We always had the one person who he would fucking drink all night, but he was the only person who could drive in a straight line. Like that was our driver. I was 13 years old. He was maybe 16, 17. Like this was just normal. But people forget those things because, like, if they were to have been pulled over, get a DUI, something that could have ruined many things for them over a long period of time. But because that didn't happen, they're not criminals. Meanwhile, somebody else in a similar situation, but then, you know, if their lifestyle is a little bit different or something, like it's just, there's just so many double standards around it, and people are being labeled criminals for no goddamn reason. Well, and like you say, like, a lot of times those double standards depend on the color of a person's skin too.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Okay. Well, where can people find your content?
You can find me, Taylor McNallie. It's almost everything. Taylor Made YYC on Twitter. And then Inclusive Canada on everything as well. So
perfect.
I have like a link tree with so many link trees within that link tree because there's a lot going on.
Nice. Yeah. I tried, I have an outro script for the end of the show that I pre-record, and I tried to put my link tree into it, but every time I kept trying to say, and you can find all my content at link.tr.ee.
Yeah, I don't know why they did that. Yeah, no.
But yeah, I'll post that in the show notes so that everybody can.
Awesome.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for your time. And I guess unless there's something else you want to mention, then that'll be it.
I think that's it. No, awesome. Everybody wear a goddamn mask, and systemic racism is real. That's it.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, that's it for the main interview. Make sure to check the show notes for links to Taylor's content and some of the groups we talked about who are doing good work on the ground in Alberta. Next up is the next installment of Red Reviews with Justin Clark on Engels' Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Hi, and welcome to Red Reviews number 6. We've gone over the hump. We are now on our way to 10.
Absolutely, and I think there's no better text tonight than to sort of celebrate getting this far into this kind of series than doing our first theoretical work of Marxism on Red Reviews.
Nice.
So tonight we're going to be discussing Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Friedrich Engels. So my plan over the next few months is I plan to do this one, some basic fundamental texts of Marxism that I think everybody should have some understanding of. This one's one of them. This one's one of them. The next one we'll do is the Communist Manifesto, which we will probably do sometime later.
That's
in the year.
Easy one. I've even read that.
And then in October, we're going to do October will be themed all around the Russian Revolution. So
nice.
October we'll be reviewing State and Revolution by Lenin, and then we'll also be reviewing a history called October, the History of the Russian Revolution by China Mieville. So
very cool.
We'll be doing that'll be all of October. But tonight's going to be our first discussion, our first foray into actual Marxist texts. And so Socialism, Utopian and Scientific was originally published in 1880. And it's actually it's like a pamphlet that Engels published at the recommendation of a friend who said, hey, because Engels was... After Marx's death in 1883, Engels sort of became the standard bearer for Marxism, at least until his death in 1895. And in the last sort of decade and a half of his life, he spent a lot of it devoted towards these larger theoretical works, ones that actually Marx wanted to get to but never got around to doing because capital consumed his life, as it does all of us. And so this part of this book that we're going to be reviewing tonight, this pamphlet, was part of a larger work called The Anti-Düring, which is this critique of this dude named Düring at the time who was writing about socialism and science. And so there's a lot of really interesting writing by Engels about the relationship between Marxist philosophy, specifically dialectical materialism, and science. And so he wrote 2 major works about that. One was called The Anti-Düring, which this thing we're going to be reading tonight and discussing tonight comes out of. And then the other thing he wrote was called Dialectics of Nature. So, people often think of like Marx as it's Marx, but for me, at least, the way I tend to read it is it's Marx and Engels. They go hand in hand. Right. They're Lenin and McCartney, man. Like they're not, And so this pamphlet was very, very successful. And it was the most, alongside the Communist Manifesto, it was the most popular pamphlet sort of popularization of Marxist philosophy in the late 19th century. So everybody read it. And if you're a Marxist, then it's one of those must-read pieces of Marxist literature. So before we get into like the text proper, I have 2 editions of this. So the edition will kind of be bouncing. But so I have an edition that's in the Marx Engels Reader, which is edited by Robert Tucker. This is an excellent primer on Marxism. I highly recommend anybody who's interested in reading Marx or Engels or getting into Marxism, this is the book to get because it has all the important stuff in it in all one volume.
Cool.
And then the other thing we'll be reviewing tonight, because there's a chunk of this that is published somewhere else, where it's from the selected works of Marx and Engels published by the Institute for Marxism-Leninism out of the Soviet Union. That has a long preface at the beginning, which has almost nothing to do, which it's very weird. Like there's this very long preface that Engels includes to the edition of 1892 that almost has nothing to do with the text proper. Okay. But it's very interesting because I think it's gonna really tap into what this show is all about, which is the intersection of skepticism, sort of secular humanism, atheism, and left philosophy, right? So in this like long introduction preface that he wrote in 1892, Engels kind of lays out how a historical materialist would look at religion and religion's development, specifically in Great Britain.
Oh, interesting.
So to explain for those who don't know, historical materialism is essentially the idea that our material conditions, the mode of production that we live in, determines much of what happens in the cultural or intellectual space. Not all of it, they interact with one another, but they're very much a part and parcel. And so he talks about how in the days of feudalism in England, the materialism of some of the earliest philosophers, people like Epicurus and Lucretius, if you go back to the Greco-Roman period, they were seen as completely unacceptable to the political and economic elite. And what changes is the development of capitalism in England, and specifically the emergence of the 18th century, and in France and in England, specifically the Enlightenment writers. So people like Diderot and Rousseau. Rousseau is a very strong influence on Marx. I mean, I think Rousseau is a strong influence on all of us who are leftists, regardless of your tendency. And how, because of the development of capitalism in England in the 18th century, it made materialism as a broader kind of understanding more acceptable to the public. So people were more skeptical and critical of religion. While at the same time, Christianity goes through a completely sort of ideological transformation as a result of capitalism. So he talks about how the ruling class sort of begins to sort of retrofit Christianity to fit the needs of capital. And so I'm trying to find a passage that I think is particularly interesting about this. And it goes through essentially like how a lot of your sort of listeners will know, a lot of us in secular space will know that sort of the development of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment led a whole new era in which religion was going to get a far more critical eye than it had during the feudal era. And you have the emergence of skepticism or atheism as a mainstream thing, more of a mainstream thing.
Right. Yeah. Lots of philosophers came out about that time where they were more critical of religion than previously. Exactly.
And so one of the things that's important is that in order for England to sort of succeed as a capitalist society, it had to essentially abandon a lot of its traditionally religious outlooks. So it abandons Catholicism. A lot of people think about Henry VIII and him getting rid of Catholicism in England, establishing the Church of England, Anglicanism, because he wanted to remarry and this and that. And some of that's obviously true. Right. But the other component was that Catholicism was the dominant religious ideology that justified feudalism, and you couldn't really fit it onto capitalism particularly well. And so Protestantism became the new form of it. So interestingly enough, you have all this development of these new sort of radical beliefs of materialism and deism and critical religious criticism, while at the same time you have the emergence of reforms of the political state. So you have like the repeal of you have the reform laws, you have the anti-corn laws. There was the corn laws, which were taxes on imports coming in, and those were repealed in the 1830s as part of the levelers. So long story short, and hopefully not to bore anybody, I think this stuff's kind of interesting, is that ultimately what happens is that religion itself, Christianity, becomes the justifying ideology of the capitalist mode of production in England. And that ideologies shift and change based on the material conditions in which one lives, which is a fundamental tenet of Marxism. It's a fundamental component of Marxism. So that's kind of the interesting thing about this long introduction, which seems like a bit of like a tangent. And in some ways, I think it is, because it doesn't have all that much to do with the main text. But I think it's something interesting. For sure. And then we can, but yeah, that's kind of where I'll stop for a second. And then we can kind of discuss this part. But I just think it's interesting.
Yeah, I think that, like you say, like materialism is a fundamental part of, I think, all leftist philosophy. And the intersection with religion is kind of, I don't know. We both came out of the atheist community, so that's interesting stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things I think that's also important too is that the religious criticism that exists and develops in the 17th and 18th centuries, through Hobbes, Locke, Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, is that ultimately what it ends up developing is the emergence of liberalism, small L liberalism, as another justifying classical liberalism, what people call classical liberalism now, because in the United States, liberal means something very different than it does in like most of the world. Right. If you go to England, liberal has a very specific thing. Like the Liberal Democratic Party. I'm not really sure where the Liberal Party in Canada fits in this whole scheme of things. I don't know if are they more like the Democrats or are they more like the Lib Dems?
They're more like the Democrats.
Okay.
Yeah, they want to say that they're more like the farther left, but that's just, they're definitely more like the Democrats.
Yeah. And so there's this interesting interrelationship going on in this sort of what they broadly call like the Age of Enlightenment or the Age of Reason, where you have the emergence of sort of radical philosophies in regard to religion, but also at the same time you have this complete transformation of Christianity as the sort of dominant ideology of the ruling class. And so, that's why like John Locke was always a good Christian. If you read his book, Letter Concerning Toleration, one of the classical political philosophy texts, the Declaration of Independence is based on it. The idea of separation of church and state is largely based on this book. He explicitly says atheists do not apply. And so he's limited by his time because, again, he is a Christian. He's writing as a Christian. And so, like, very few of the Enlightenment era were actually explicitly atheists. I think Diderot was one. But like very little of them actually were atheists. This is one of the things I find very frustrating in the sort of atheist movement or the secular movement in general, is their misrepresentation of the Enlightenment, where they sort of think of it as being explicitly and exclusively anti-religious when in fact it was not. The Enlightenment was in many ways a phenomenon of religious criticism to get to the heart of a way of retaining religion through a lens of reason. This is where you get Immanuel Kant's idea, religion within the limits of reason alone. Dialogues concerning natural religion, Hume. And Marx and Engels saw themselves very much in this tradition. I always say that, Marxism is not the rejection of the Enlightenment, it's the fulfillment of it.
Right.
And so, that's why the reliance upon human reason, albeit flawed, and the importance of understanding materialism and material conditions matched with an understanding of history. And I think that's what sets Marxism apart from like classical liberal ideas. I mean, obviously, besides like the whole like, we want to get rid of it and create, communism. Right. The other component of it is it's the understanding of history and understanding that material conditions are predicated upon historical conditions and they interrelate with one another. And so that gets into the heart of sort of the main body of the text. So Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. So what does the title mean? Utopian and Scientific. What does this mean, right? So Marx's project, and Marxism in general, is what they call scientific socialism. Now that kind of sounds probably like a little weird. Let me explain what that largely means. So in the text, Engels talks about how some of the early socialist leaders, those who sort of moved the cause for socialism forward, they're the big three that he talks about. Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, and Robert Owen. Those are the three he talks about.
Okay.
They are all incredibly important to the understanding of the history of the development of modern socialism. But the big issue was that they all had limitations. Each one of those three leaders had some level of limitations.
As leaders often do, right? So the problem with Saint-Simon was that he didn't have, one of the things he did understand, one of the crucial elements of Saint-Simon's thought
is the idea Marx writes, or Lenin, not Lenin, Engels writes, knowledge of economic conditions are the basis of political institutions. And that's something that's in Saint-Simon, but it's there in embryo. That's Engels's words. So he doesn't have like the kind of comprehensive view that later writers would have. So he has sort of the inklings of historical materialism, but it's not really developed yet.
Okay.
It's just kind of in the beginning. Then you have Charles Fourier. And Fourier was another thinker who grasped another component of this, right? Because the one thing that Simon didn't have, he had the sort of historical understanding and the materialistic conception, but he didn't have dialectics. And Fourier was the other way around, where he had dialectics, but he didn't have the historical materialism. Now, let me explain what that means to people. Dialectics is like...
Dialectics is complicated.
It's extremely complicated to people, but the way to understand it, the very simplistic way of understanding it is, most of Western thought is based on what's called modal logic, which is basically like A goes to B, which goes to C, which goes to D.
Yeah.
Like it's very linear.
Yeah.
It's like a straight line that goes from one end to the other. Dialectics, an understanding of dialectics, is not so much about the straight line. It's more about the interactions of things going together with one another.
Yeah.
You know, one way to think about it is if you think of like the dual split experiments they did in physics, where you have two lines and you have particles going from one end to the other. In traditional logic, you would assume, logically, that they would go in a straight line, the shortest possible line to get from point A to point B, but they don't actually do that. Right. What do? They bounce all over the place. But in bouncing all over the place, they actually do get to the shortest end, the shortest distance between the two, but they bounce all the way around. That's a component of dialectics. It's understanding the relationships between things. So when we're talking about historical materialism, the modes of production influence the cultural systems within it. And the cultural systems influence the material forces of production. And it's like a dance that goes back and forth.
Yeah. And
so that's what dialectics is all about. It's all about understanding the relationships between things and understanding the contradictions between things. So this is where you get into Hegel. And this is something Fourier had. It's this idea that you have the thesis and you have the antithesis. And somewhere in the middle is the synthesis. And that's dialectics. It's finding the balance between the two and it's also about the changing of quality or quantity into quality. So this is something like in biological evolution, right? Where at some point you have so many quantitative changes within an organism that qualitatively they become a completely different organism over time. Dialectics works the same way in understanding society. So at some point, all these like little tweaks and changes that happen within a society eventually qualitatively changes the society in general.
Yeah.
So this is how you go from feudalism to capitalism to hopefully socialism, communism, and those stages. And this is what it gets from Hegel. So Fourier, in Marx's estimation, or in Engels' estimation, understands the dialectical part, but he doesn't understand the materialist part, and he doesn't understand the historical part.
Okay.
And then you have Robert Owen. And Robert Owen is, in my opinion, the most interesting of these three, because he's the guy who's like, it's all great to like think about all this stuff, but I'm going to try to do it. And so,
okay.
So Robert Owen was this 29-year-old man who set up this factory in Lanark, Scotland, that was essentially run as a cooperative. And it didn't succeed, but it had the germ of the idea of what, the idea of communism is, from each according to its ability to each according to its need, right? And what he did was he developed an entire society in which people's fundamental needs could be met. There was a currency within the society that people could exchange for their labor. But ultimately it sort of fell apart. And the reason that it fell apart was because Owen didn't have the class analysis. He didn't have the understanding of class. So he sort of assumed that we would just all unite together and fight against a brutal system. Well, you can't really do that because fundamentally there are some people in that side of the equation who are against you.
Yeah, that's right.
They're against your interests. And so what does this all get us to? This gets us to Marxism. So what's important to understanding of Marxism and why it matters and why it's so influential? And So let's get into what the fundamental things of Marxism are. So you have historical materialism, we've discussed.
Yep.
You have dialectics, we've discussed. And you have class struggle. And those three are all very, very important. And these are things we'll go into more when we discuss the manifesto, but they're here in Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. And so, but he also ties in the scientific component. And this is where you get the concept of scientific socialism. So utopian socialism is sort of this broad kind of, nebulous, brotherhood of man concept, right?
Okay, yep.
Whereas Marxism is rooted fundamentally in a far more empirical, materialist fashion than, say, more of the classical, maybe anarchist or political thought of the previous generations. So Marx and Engels were extremely critical of the sort of anarchist tradition.
Right.
They were critical of Proudhon. They were critical of Bakunin. And fundamentally what they had a huge problem with was they felt like there was no true theoretical or material understanding of conditions that would lead to the sort of future goals. So it's really nice to talk about like everybody should live in harmony and peace and equality,
right.
But it's another thing to actually make that happen. And how do we make that happen?
Right.
And so that's really what, that's what Marx gives us and what Engels sort of illustrates. So I'm going to share with you a quote that kind of encapsulates some of this from utopianism. Oh, and I'm going to share a couple quotes because these are all pretty good, and then we can maybe talk about them. So
sure.
the pamphlet opens with, modern socialism is, in its essence, the direct product of the recognition, on the one hand, of the class antagonisms existing in the society of today between proprietors and non-proprietors, between capitalists and wage workers, on the other hand, of the anarchy existing in production. So that's super, super important. But then to kind of sum up our discussion so far, Engels has this great quote where he goes, these two great discoveries, the materialistic conception of history and the revelation of the secret of capitalism production through surplus value, we owe to Marx. With these discoveries, socialism became a science. So that's the other very important component of Marxism that's within this pamphlet and within all of Marx and Engels' work is the theory of surplus value. So everybody knows the labor theory of value. That value comes through labor. Well, Marx takes that even further and says, well, this is how capitalism functions. It functions through the extraction of surplus labor. We're never ever paid what we're actually worth on the marketplace.
Right.
And the reason for that is because they have to extract surplus value in order for it to survive. And then that becomes capital. Today we call it profit.
Yeah.
And so those are the really important conceptions. I know I've thrown a lot out there, so we can kind of stop for a second.
Yeah, no worries. I think, I suppose it's depending on who is listening, there might be more background that they would need, but there's still, I think this is kind of the basics in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I think that it's the basics because these are some of the fundamental tenets of understanding left politics. And I think whether you're a Marxist or not, I think there's just some fundamental tenets of Marxism that sort of apply universally to everything. Yeah. And so I think these are some of them, right?
I think like a lot of maybe it's stuff that came after, like anarchists that came after have incorporated some of this Marxist type of thinking into the anarchist philosophies, and so it's entwined with almost all left thinking at this point.
I agree. I know there are some people who sort of explicitly identify themselves as non-Marxists, but I think that regardless of whether you explicitly identify as a Marxist or not, some of these are just fundamental facts, which I think, and fundamental truths about society that are very, very important. That's why I would say that, like, in my opinion, the two most important thinkers of the 19th century were Charles Darwin and Karl Marx. They were the two most important, because Darwin and even Engels understands this point and explains this point in this pamphlet, where he talks about how Darwin understood that nature is dialectical. He says, nature works dialectically and not metaphysically, that she does not move in the eternal oneness of a perpetually recurring cycle, but goes through a real historical evolution. In this connection, Darwin must be named before all others. He dealt the metaphysical conception of nature the heaviest blow by his proof that all organic beings, plants and animals, and man himself are the products of a process of evolution going on through millions of years. And so, and we know, like historically, that Engels and Marx, and I think more Engels than Marx, both read Darwin.
Right.
And were influenced by Darwin, like, no doubt. Because if you want to understand, if you go back to the 17th century and you talk about somebody like Thomas Hobbes in his book Leviathan, this political treatise where he's, and he is trying to do the sort of grand universal project that Marx is doing, but he's doing it in a different era. And so he's like, I'm going to be doing for political science or, I'm going to do for society what Newton did for science.
Right.
And set it upon universal laws, right? And Marx is doing the exact same thing, but he's doing it 2.5 centuries later. And instead of Newton being the central influencing force, it's Darwin. Because what Engels and what Marxism teaches us is that society is very much like biological evolution. There's social evolution, there's historical evolution, and then it's based in real material projects, real material conditions.
Right.
And because when he's talking about metaphysics, right, that's another big sort of fancy word. What does that mean, right? Basically what that is the philosophical term that means, things that are outside of the realm of material conceptions. The idea of like souls or God or, spirits or anything like that. It's ethereal. That's not a part of the material, the stuff that you can touch kind of, that you can be a part of.
Right.
And what Darwin does is he completely blows apart that whole notion that society is built around these metaphysical notions, that animals are built around that. And then what Marx does is he does the same thing, but for society, for humans.
Right.
And he blows apart these sort of metaphysical conceptions that are not based in material reality. And this goes back to one of Marx and Engels' most central works, which is a book called The German Ideology, wherein they talk about how, philosophers before them were sort of bringing earth to heaven. And what we seek to do is to bring heaven to earth and to flip the script. And I think that's the really interesting understanding of what it means to think like a leftist or even think like a Marxist. Yeah,
I think, I guess ultimately it's the idea that you can make the world good, right?
Yes, that you can actually make the world good, and we know how we can do that, right?
Right. We can figure this out and actually carry it out.
Yes, and the way that we do that is through completely changing the forces of production. So in capitalist society, the way that forces of production are shaped is that there's incredible amount of socialization. This is the word they'll use. Lenin uses it too in Imperialism. His book Imperialism, that capitalist firms go through increasingly more complicated stages of socialization, basically cooperation, planning. Huge corporations are planning behemoths.
Right.
The reason that like Amazon or Walmart or Google or any of these organizations work so well is because there's an incredible amount of economic planning within them.
Yeah.
Right. But then what happens is that all of that then becomes to the, and this is not to shit on the anarchists, but like basically like it's left up to the whims of the market.
Right.
The market is sort of anarchic in the sort of colloquial sense, because I know anarchism means a very specific thing in political philosophy, but in sort of general, in general terms, there's chaos within the market system, but there's planning within the organizations. And there's this disconnect of like, well, that's why like there's a lot of people that are unemployed. That's why people don't get their basic needs met. That's why, we create food for 10 billion people, but people starve. It's the chaos of, you have the socialization of production, and then you have the sort of chaos of dissemination. And what Engels argues for is that you build a new society in which not only do the means of production become socialized in the sense that they become increasingly planned, but that the distribution of that is also then going to become increasingly planned. And that gets away, and so, I mean, and how does this play out, right? So one of the incredibly important quotes that he has is, the contradiction between socialized production and capitalistic appropriation manifested itself as the antagonism of proletariat and bourgeoisie. So you have all of this socialized production where people's needs could be met, but then you have all of this chaos within the capitalist system because it's based on profit rather than based on planning or need. Right. And those things are going to constantly butt heads, and they butt heads in the form of these class antagonisms between the owning class, the bourgeoisie, and the working class, the proletariat. And that the only way to sort of stop that is to resolve the contradiction. And the way you resolve that contradiction is by completely transforming the mode of production to the benefit of all and to the benefit of the working class. And the reason why Marx and Engels put such a stress on the working class is not because they thought that they were like especially noble or good. It was because they have within their own power the capacity to change the system itself, because they can walk away. So you can have strikes where people just leave. And they also show that with a society with a high degree of planning, you don't need the capitalists. You don't need them. They're these middlemen who basically lord over people and then keep the profits, but they don't actually really serve a useful function. And so that's why, we shape it, we can reshape society so that we can do away with these antagonisms. And ultimately that basically means that we go to communism, and, which, sounds pretty great.
That's right. Which is kind of the goal, right?
That's kind of the goal, right? And so, he talks also about this is a really great quick sentence that sums up, it's a really good, succinct summary of what we've just discussed. So the mode of production is in rebellion against the mode of exchange. So the mode of production is extremely planned and socialized, but the mode of exchange is extremely chaotic and up to whims and market forces that are completely divorced from human need. And those are butting heads with one another. And to resolve it, we create a new mode of production. He also has some interesting stuff. One thing that's an interesting side point that I found interesting is that he's not against, he does a really good thing in this little pamphlet about talking about how socialism does not necessarily mean that the government owns it.
Right.
This is something that, and so this is really, really important to understand. So he says the modern state, no matter what its form, is essentially a capitalist machine. The state of the capitalists, the ideal personification of the total national capital. The more it proceeds to the taking over of productive forces, the more does it actually become the national capitalist, the more citizens does it exploit. State ownership of the productive forces is not the solution of the conflict, but concealed within it are the technical conditions that form the elements of that solution. And that basically, he says, the solution can only consist in the practical recognition of the social nature of the modern forces of production, and therefore in the harmonizing of the modes of production, appropriation, and exchange within the socialized character of the means of production. And this can only come about by a society openly and directly taking possession of the productive forces which have outgrown all control, except that as a society as a whole. So he's basically calling for revolution, that the way to solve this is to resolve the contradiction, and you do that through revolution. Yeah. And
you can't just elect people who then use the state to change who owns things, I guess.
Exactly. And then within this pamphlet too, you get into the discussion of the withering away of the state, which is something that comes up in Lenin's State Revolution, that the idea that if you move a society, and again, this goes back to dialectics, right? We were talking about how quantity changes into quality, right? Yeah. So if you make all these quantitative changes within the forces of production, eventually, qualitatively, it will change into something completely different. Yeah. And so if the proletariat seizes political power and turns the means of production into state property, but in doing this, it abolishes itself as proletariat, abolishes all class distinctions and class antagonisms, abolishes also the state as a state. So, yeah. And, here we go. This is probably the most famous quote from the pamphlet.
Okay.
State interference in social relations becomes, in one domain after another, superfluous and then dies out of itself. So he's talking about the withering of the way of the state under socialism, and sort of the broad strokes of it, according to the Marxist and to a certain extent Leninist conception of the state, that eventually what would happen is you have a revolution, the workers take control, they seize the means of production, and you create the semi-state. And the semi-state is socialism, because socialism is, and it's going to have the sort of the birth pangs of the old, where you may still have a state, you may still have markets, you may still have inequalities, but you're moving towards a better system. And then eventually those antagonisms and contradictions wither out by the forces of production changing, and you eventually get to communism. And this is where you get to the most important quote from this pamphlet. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and by the conduct of processes of production. The state is not abolished, it dies out. So that's, I think, the main difference, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, you are an anarchist, I'm not. That's, I think, the main, theoretical difference between, say, our anarchists and Marxists, is that Marxists are like, we would love the idea of no state. But the problem is you can't just like smash the state and make it go away and then expect like anarchism to work. There has to be some kind of administration. And so socialism becomes the semi-state, which then develops into communism. And communism is the stateless society, where instead of having that government of persons, we have the administration of things. And in Marx and Engels' conception, this is where human history really begins. Everything we're living right now is still very much the primitive stages. We're not that far out of the cave.
Right.
We're just not, right?
Yeah.
And so, communism is when you're out of the cave fully and you can see the sun.
Yeah, I think so under in anarchist philosophy that I'm aware of, the transition state, we do tend to think that is going to be co-opted by people who are corrupted, and the administration of things is going to turn into just another authoritarian state.
Yes.
So that's where the anarchist is like, yeah, we get where you're coming from, but we don't think that's going to work either.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point. And just to make it clear, the thing is, like, Marx didn't actually write that much on the state per se. Like, he never wrote a book on the state. Okay. He never got around to it. That was going to be a volume of Capital. I can't remember if it was supposed to be like the 5th or 6th perspective volume of Capital, where he was going to develop his theory of the state and how the state was in relationship to capital. He died. He never got around to it. Right. So everything we know about the state, we know through a bunch of his writings all over the place. And so we kind of developed general concepts of what that would mean. And then Engels, it's the same thing, right? So Engels did write a couple of things about this. So you have The Origin of Family, Private Property in the State, which he wrote. You have, obviously, the one we're reading now, which has some of this. And then the concepts of the Marxist conception of the state then gets developed further by Lenin. And we'll go into that when we do State and Revolution, because a lot of the ideas that are in this pamphlet that are later on are things that Lenin is going to flesh out more theoretically. Right. And so, but you're right. Like, it's a very good anarchist point to say, hey, this sort of semi-state you're talking about, like, it can devolve into Stalinism, right? It can devolve into a sort of, a brutal system that, on the surface looks like you're achieving it, right? But then when you actually get underneath it, you kind of go, oh, wait, this isn't really what it is, right? So that's how some people
still have this massive hierarchical structure, and the proletariat is suffering.
Yep. This is how a lot of people see the People's Republic of China, right? So, because I don't know about you, but I actually find like President Xi Jinping's policy letters fascinating. I haven't read. Fascinating. So they're interesting because he's reconciling what the mode of production in China is with Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. So he's like trying to make them work. Okay. And essentially what he's arguing for is, we're eventually going to get to the semi-state of socialism. within within a certain amount of lifetime. I mean, the big problem I think we all have on the left, and this is the sort of when is Jesus coming back problem.
Yes,
which is that, like,
very much so.
Where it's like people are like, oh, any minute now Jesus is coming back. It's like any minute now the workers are going to seize
Viva
the
la
revolution. Viva la revolution, right? And it's like that's gonna anytime now we're gonna get that worker state, and it's like no. That's not true. And I think
have to at some point do something.
We have to actively fight for it, right?
Yeah.
And that can take many forms, right? So that can take the form of direct action, that can take the form of strikes, that can take the form of political education, which I think is what my expertise is in, I admire the people who are protesters, and I mean, I've been to protests, I've done protests myself, and I love doing them. But, I wouldn't consider myself like a professional protester.
People who do it regularly, I find very admirable. Like
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, this is how I try to articulate to people what I'm thinking. Because I don't know about you, but I see what we seek to achieve as a long-term project. So if we don't die out by nuclear weapons or climate change, this is the long-term project that we can develop, right? Yeah. This is a marathon, not a sprint. I think in our very first, one of our very first conversations together, I talked about how the political right in the United States was essentially, it was like a 30-year project over time where we went from the sort of high liberalism of the New Deal and the Great Society to Reagan. And how did that happen? It was because the political right understood the lessons of the political left. I mean, they understood Leninism. They got it. But they just used it for the political right. Yeah. And used it as a means to create these sort of cadres or vanguards of ideological purity that could then influence the political system. And I would argue that we need to do that again, but from a left perspective. And so I'm not like a sectarianist. I have disagreements with people politically. Like I'm a Marxist. But like my thing on the subject is like if you can create some kind of revolutionary vanguard party, or if you have a trade union party, you have an anarchist, and we're all trying to figure out where we fit in this space to move the cause of socialism, I think that's a good thing. And people often think that Marxists are, we tend to be dogmatic. Some of that's true. Although if you read Zizek and you read Chesterton, sometimes being dogmatic is not a bad thing. But I'll leave that for another discussion. But, long story short, the other thing that's interesting in this pamphlet is he talks about how like nationalization, just if you nationalize industries, that doesn't necessarily mean it's socialism, and all kinds of stuff that's kind of interesting.
I would just lean towards, for certain things, it would be more like a decommodification rather than nationalization or stuff like that.
Yes, and that's the difference, right? And that's exactly what Engels argues in this pamphlet. And so, in sum, what is the difference between, scientific socialism and utopian socialism? Scientific socialism is predicated on a few things. It's predicated on historical materialism. It's predicated on dialectics. It's predicated on the understanding of class struggle. And it's predicated on the idea of understanding the law of surplus value. And having an understanding of each of those things gets you from the sort of nebulous sort of brotherhood of man kind of socialism of like the 17th and 18th centuries to the real systematic understanding of the modes of production and how to change them that you get with Marxism. And then I'll leave you with a couple of really great quotes from the end of the pamphlet where he says, it is the ascent of man from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. That's what socialism is. And I agree, right? We talk all the time about freedom. You hear this all the time from right wingers. They always talk about freedom. It's like, well, freedom to do what? Yeah. That's and freedom for who?
Freedom to buy 30 different flavors of ketchup.
Yeah. Freedom to buy shit, right?
Yeah.
My credit card I use every day literally is called the Freedom Card. Like that's what it's called.
While they shackle you in chains of debt.
While they shackle you in chains of debt. Exactly. Right. So you have that, and then you also have the end of the pamphlet, which is awesome. To accomplish this act of universal emancipation is the historical mission of the modern proletariat. The universal emancipation meaning socialism, the movement towards socialism. To thoroughly comprehend the historical conditions, and thus the very nature of this act, to impart to the now oppressed proletarian class a full knowledge of the conditions and of the meaning of the momentous act it is called upon to accomplish, This is the task of the theoretical expression of the proletarian movement, scientific socialism. And so that's a really great summary of where he's coming from and what Marxism is all about. And in later discussions, we will take this even further, where we will, like I said earlier, we will talk about two fundamental texts of Marxism, where we'll talk with Communist Manifesto and we'll talk about State and Revolution.
Nice.
So yeah, this is one of the essential pamphlets of Marxism. I highly encourage people to read it. The nice thing about Marxist writings is if you're not like a person who likes books, I know some people aren't always the biggest like book people. People like to read online. All of this stuff is online for free. So you can read it at Marxist. I think it's Marxist.org is the library where you can read all of this stuff for free. And you can download it. You can print it out. You can put it on your phone. You can do whatever. So you can read everything there. And a lot of times the editions that are available on that website are the ones that are the sort of approved texts, the ones that were approved by the writers. They were approved by editors like Robert Tucker, or they were approved by the Institute for Marxism-Leninism out of the CCCP. So it's good stuff. So yeah, that's our first sort of foray into theoretical Marxism.
That's awesome. No, I look forward to hearing more about the other ones. I have read a couple things, like I've read Communist Manifesto. I think these are, some of this stuff is like you say, the fundamentals that you have to, at least to understand some of the left philosophy. But if you aren't a reader, then perhaps our little reviews and discussions will help.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're ever interested in it more, I highly recommend reaching out to other resources. So, I think it's In Defense of Marxism is an incredible website that was really important for me in my political evolution. It's run by the International Marxist Tendency, which is a Trotskyist outfit out of England. But they're great. It's an incredible website that lays out, it has like pages that are literally just like, what is dialectics? What is historical materialism? Like, what do these things mean? Right. And because I think sometimes we think about it, it's like, oh, this is so like fancy language, whatever. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it all boils down to something I remember hearing from Michael Brooks years ago, which is that the essence of what we're fighting for is there are people out there who took your shit, and your goal is to defeat them and take your shit back.
Yeah,
that's it,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's perfect.
Awesome.
So I guess, as usual, where can people find more from you?
Sure. So you can find me at justinclark.org. That's where I have my writing, and that's where I have some of my other, public history work. And then I think I mentioned last time, I have an article about Lenin and religion. That's available through Midwestern Marx, which is an online publication. And then I just recently published an article about Robert Ingersoll, my thesis subject. He's right. It's always hard to do this with a video. Right there.
Yeah. Because you're used to it being a mirror, right? But now it's not a mirror.
It's not, right? It's not. And I wrote an article about him and his supposed influence on the work of Lew Wallace, the Christian author. Who wrote Ben-Hur, if you've ever seen that movie or whatever. And then, in terms of things coming down the pike, I'm hoping to, and this is going to be a read review down the road too, but I'm developing this sort of, I'm doing a sort of a dual book review in my head of like, why hasn't socialism caught on in America? Like, and we're going to get two perspectives on that. So we're going to get a perspective from somebody who's like a democratic socialist who's not a Marxist, and then we're going to get a Marxist perspective. Nice. So we'll do that eventually in the future. But yeah, that's kind of what's going on with me. And then the other thing too is I highly encourage people to check out this podcast, become a patron. I am a patron. And if you become a patron, you get to hear all the super spicy stuff we do in the post game.
That's right.
And so, yeah, I highly encourage people to become patrons because I really believe in what you're doing. And I really can't thank you enough for giving me a platform to do all this really fun stuff.
Oh, thank you for doing it. I cannot often find the time to do the research that's necessary for a show like this, but I think that this is important. And I'm glad that I can have you as a contributor.
Thank you. Next month, we're going to be doing, since it's July, we're going to be doing some sort of we're going to be doing some sort of American history related stuff for the 4th of July. Even though I know Juneteenth is super important too, and I don't want to discount that. And with that in mind, the next book that we'll be doing is another incredible essential work of 19th century thought, which is Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. That'll be the next one that we do. And I'm very excited about that one because we're not just going to talk about the narrative, but we're also going to talk about some of his essays. And most importantly, we're going to talk about one called What is the 4th of July to the Slave, which is an essential lecture that he gave in the 1850s that I think should be required reading for everyone. So we're going to talk all about that. And then the one after that, we're going to be doing Nixon Land by Rick Perlstein, which is the sprawling history of the late 1960s and early 70s. And this is a book in a series of books that he's written on the rise of American conservatism. And I think a lot of the sort of discussions we have today of sort of class analysis versus culture and what is the working class and how do these parties change? All of those discussions were happening back when Nixon was around, and they're very relevant for today. So that's what we got coming over the next couple episodes. Awesome.
Well, thank you again, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you.
All right. I hope you've enjoyed the show so far. Before I call this to an end of an already very long video / podcast, I'm going to read 15 minutes of The Anarchist Turn by Jacob Blumenfield and Chiara Bottici and Simon Kirkley. This will be a reoccurring segment until the book is finished, or I get bored, or I feel the need to switch books for a while. I think that reading a little bit every week or every 2 weeks is an important thing that I can do for my listeners and my viewers, and it will help me read more content on anarchism and various other subjects as well. So with that, I'm going to start with The Anarchist Turn for about 15 minutes. Hey folks, I suspect that we probably will only get to the through the introduction here. I'm just going to read 15 minutes. This is The Anarchist Turn by Jacob Blumenfeld, Chiara Bottici, and Simon Kirkley. Again, totally sorry about my pronunciation of those names. But it's published by Pluto Press. The introduction is by Simon Kirkley. But 15 minutes. All right. Starting now. Introduction, Simon Kirkley. The contributions that make up this book are derived from papers presented at a conference called The Anarchist Turn, which took place at the New School for Social Research in New York on May 5th and 6th in 2011. The three editors of this book, myself, Jacob Blumenfeld, and Chiara Bottici, were also the conference organizers. I have left this introduction in almost exactly the form in which it was initially composed, because the multiplicity of events that we could summarize with the word Occupy that erupted in the autumn of 2011 would have required separate and sustained analysis and revision. Let's just say that some of the hope that Jacob, Chiara, and the other contributors to The Anarchist Turn expressed in their talks, which the reader will find in the chapters of this book, found unanticipated and glorious expression in events later in the year, and that was only the beginning. I would like to begin with a text co-written by the three people who collaborated on the organization of The Anarchist Turn. Collaboration or working together is the key here. It is the very ethos of the anarchism that we intended to both discuss and try to enact with this conference. The three of us have worked together closely over the past year in order to make something happen that might simply be interesting, maybe even worthwhile. But we do not know what is going to happen. This could be rubbish. This could be a disaster. We hope not, but you never know. For a long time, the word anarchist has been used as an insult. This is because, at least since Hobbes, and maybe for a lot longer, the concept of anarchy has been extended from its etymological meaning, absence of centralized government, to that of pure disorder. The idea being that without a sovereign, with a sovereign state, the life of individuals can only be miserable, brutish, and short. This shift in the meaning of anarchy was certainly useful in the ideological discourse of justification of modern sovereign states, but it does not provide an understanding of what anarchy might be, particularly when those states have either died or shriveled or transformed or become an imperium that desperately tries to shore up its authority through a politics of the external and internal enemy. However, in the last decade, maybe longer, this caricature of anarchy and anarchism has begun to crack. what we a little too easily call globalization and the social movements it spawned seem to have proven what anarchists have long been advocating. An anarchical order is not just desirable, but also feasible, practicable, and enactable. This has led to a revitalized interest in the subterranean anarchist tradition and the understanding of anarchy as collective, self-organization without centralized authority. But the ban on anarchism has not yet been lifted. It has a bit of a note, Blumenfeld, Bottici, and Critchley, 2011. The aim of this conference is to help lift that ban and argue for an anarchist turn in politics and in our thinking of the political. We want to discuss anarchism with the specific reference to political philosophy in its many historical and geographical variants, but also in relation to other disciplines, like politics, anthropology, where anarchism has had a long influence, economics, history, sociology, and of course geography. Why are so many anarchists geographers, cartographers, or explorers like Kropotkin? We need new map. Our approach is, first, transdisciplinary. Second, it also wants to put theory and praxis into some sort of communication, and that is why we have the work of academics here alongside activists. And many of the academics are activists. By bringing together academics and activists in some case past and in other cases very present, this conference will assess the nature and effectiveness of anarchist politics in our times. Of all the political visions of another social order or another way of conceiving and practicing social relations, anarchism has proved the most condemned and yet the most resilient. Outlawed, repudiated, ridiculed by liberals, by neoliberals, but most of all, of course, by Marxists. From the expulsion of the anarchists from the meeting of the International in The Hague in 1872 onwards, the anarchist idea simply will not die. There are multiple motivations behind this conference, including the fact that anarchism is still scoffed at and laughed at by political philosophers, that it still has a minor academic presence in relation to liberalism, or Marxism, or Frankfurt School critical theory, which have always done such good academic business, that it consists of many thinkers, like Stirner, Proudhon, Bakunin, Kropotkin, Malatesta, who are not read as widely as they should be. I could go on. But there are other motivations. We might recall that this is the Arendt-Sherman Conference on Political Philosophy at the New School for Social Research. For obvious and perhaps understandable reasons, people tend to prioritize the work of Hannah Arendt over Rainer Sherman. Now, although Arendt was no particular friend of anarchism, her work might be harnessed for a thinking through of the politics of the street, as Judith Butler recently attempted, 2011. But it is perhaps the political dimension of Sherman's work that should be emphasized here. In particular, and I'm going to destroy it, Le Principe de Anarchie, Heidegger et la question I'm not French, de la guerre, 1982, a nicely oxymoronic title that was mysteriously rendered into English as Heidegger on Being and Acting, from Principles to Acting, or to Anarchy, 1987. This was a hugely important book when I was a graduate student in France in the 1980s. My teacher, Dominique Génicot, was a close friend of Reiner's, and it was through him that I first read Sherman. Indeed, as readers of Miguel Abensur's decisively important book, La démocratie contre l'État, 1997, which has finally been published as Democracy Against the State, 2011, will know. Abensur tries to bring together Arendtian and Shermanian, oh boy, themes and events of what the very young Marx called true democracy in 1843. True democracy, or what Abensur also calls insurgent democracy, reactivates the anarchic impulse and might allow us to imagine a deconstruction of the political field based on the primacy of an arch, a first principle, a supreme power, an act of sovereignty or dominion, and the cultivation of what we might call an anarchic metapolitics. There is also a very local and nicely ironic motivation for this conference. A little, in fact very little, over 2 years ago, in April 2009, 65 Fifth Avenue, the former home of the New School for Social Research, was occupied for a second time by a small number of students who were protesting peacefully for improved study conditions and for accountability and transparency from the school administration. Wild anarchist claims, as you can tell. Some say the former president of the new school, although he denied it, dialed Operation Cobra. Cobra is all in caps, for those who are just listening. And hundreds of police descended on the building with dogs, hostage negotiators, the whole paranoid security apparatus of the homeland. Students were chased down the street and force was used against them. Many were arrested. Then, of course, lies were told about what had happened. A long, rancorous situation ensued. For those of us who came to work at the New School for Social Research because of its radical traditions of intellectual freedom, activism, disobedience, and protest, and the New School is an institution born out of protest at a war and established as a place for refuge for those threatened by war, this was deeply disturbing, deeply troubling, and This was a deeply troubling and painful period. I remember being in 65 Fifth Avenue during the first occupation in December 2008, being given some photocopied texts by Tikkun to read, which came out last year in Introduction to Civil War 2010. They had just been translated as part of the occupation itself. I'm really happy that some of the accused of Tarnac are here with us today. Chiara, Jacob, and I spent a lot of time thinking about whom we might invite to contribute, and we were delighted and flattered that so many people accepted our invitation. In addition to the people I have already mentioned, we are immensely grateful for the presence of Laura Carati, Andra Grubakic, Alberto Toscano, Ben Morey, and Cindy Milstein. I would also like to thank Jacob and Chiara themselves, Todd May, Cinzia Aruza, Benu Barugu, Stefan Duncombe, Stephanie Wakefield, Mitchell Verder, and Judith Butler. Anarchism is not so much a grand unified theory of revolution, based on a socio-economic metaphysics and a philosophy of history, as a moral conviction, an ethical disposition that finds expression in practice and as practice. Anarchism is a different way of conceiving and enacting social relations between people, where they are not defined by the authority of the state, the law, and the police, but by free agreement between them. Its aspiration was perhaps best described by the English poet Shelley in Prometheus Unbound. Scepterless, free, uncircumscribed, but man, equal, unclassed, tribeless, and nationless, exempt from awe, worship, degree, the king over himself, just, wise, just, gentle, wise. Because of my distaste for the macho mannerism and fake virility of contemporary neo-Leninism, I name no names. I personally favor the rather quiet and indeed crappy small-scale and rather English version of anarchism that you find in writers like Colin Ward and George Woodcock, where anarchism begins while planting vegetables and designing playgrounds for kids. Arguably, this tradition goes back to 1381, the Peasants' Revolt and the Lollards. The only extant fragment from John Ball preserved and probably embellished by chroniclers is worth recalling here. Things cannot go well in England, nor ever will, until all goods are held in common, and until there will be neither serfs nor gentlemen, and we shall be equal. For what reason have they, whom we call lords, got the best of us? How did they deserve it? Why did they keep us in bondage? If we all descended from one father and one mother, Adam and Eve, how can they assert or prove that they are more masters than ourselves? Except perhaps that they make us work and produce for them to spend. Ball, as cited in Froissart 1968. Things did not go well in England, sadly. I have been combing through my books for an articulation, if not a definition, of anarchism with which we might begin. The best example I know is from Errico Malatesta, from his wonderful pamphlet Anarchy in 1891. He writes, "Abolition of government does not and cannot signify destruction of the social bond. Quite the opposite. The cooperation which today is forced, and which is today directly beneficial to a few, will be free, voluntary, and direct, working to the advantage of all, and will be all the more intense and effective for that. Out of the free collaboration of everyone, thanks to the spontaneous combination of men in accordance with their needs and sympathies, from the bottom up, from the simple to the complex, starting from the most immediate interests and working towards the most general, there will arise a social organization, the goal of which will be the greatest well-being and fullest freedom of all. Such a society of free human beings, such a society of friends, is anarchy." Malatesta, 1891. We hope something of that friendship, something of that social bond, will be in evidence in the next couple of days. Simon Crickley, May 5th, 2011. And that's it for the introduction. Then they go into acknowledgements and a list of references. And then into part 1, Subverting Boundaries, which I will read for 15 minutes next episode. Thank you very much. That's all, folks. Thanks for listening. Remember to share this show with your friends and on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. It's really appreciated, and it helps me spend more time on this and my other projects when I'm not at work so that I don't have to work as many hours at gig jobs. If you want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can send me money on PayPal at paypal.me/brainstormpodcast. If you can't contribute financially, then a 5-star rating and a review on your podcast app of choice or one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then make sure to check out my link tree at linktr.ee/skepticalcory. You can find all my social media stuff there, as well as links to my other shows, which include Skeptarchy, which is a panel show I do with some very smart people, and From Many People's Strength, which is a podcast about Saskatchewan politics. My Twitter is @SkepticalLefty, and my Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, or you can send me a friend request at facebook.com/CJBrainstorm. I accept most friend requests. You can also email me at themindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening or watching, and remember, the truth leans left.